The potato digger was leaning against the fence post on the east side of the equipment shed in the fall of 1948. And the first time Walter Speck's neighbor, Ray Kimball, saw it. Ray stood looking at it for a full minute without saying anything. Then he said it looked like something a man would build if he'd never seen a potato digger before. Walter was 41 years old. Had farmed 80 acres of sandy loam ground in Aroostook County, Maine, his entire adult life. Potatoes on the south fields, oats on the north fields, a woodlot along the back boundary that he cut for pulpwood in winter when the ground was frozen and the roads were firm. Aroostook County was potato country, the northernmost agricultural land in the eastern United States. And the potato harvest in September and October was the event that everything else in the county year organized itself around. The commercial potato digger he'd been using was a borrowed single-row unit from his uncle's place in Presque Isle. His uncle had died in June of 1948, and the estate had been divided. The digger had gone to his uncle's son in Caribou, who needed it himself. Buying a replacement was not straightforward. A new commercial single-row elevator digger from H.P. Hood's implement dealer in Presque Isle ran $340. A used one in fair condition, if you could find one in Aroostook County in the fall of 1948, ran $180 to $220. Walter had $90 in the operating account and a potato crop that needed to come out of the ground before the October frosts. He spent 2 evenings looking at what he had in the equipment shed and 1 evening drawing on a piece of brown paper bag. Then he built the digger. The basic mechanical requirement of a potato digger was not complicated in principle. A share, a flat steel blade, ran beneath the potato row at 8 to 10 inches depth, lifting the soil and the tubers together. The lifted mass passed over a series of steel rods or chains arranged in a moving belt that allowed the soil to fall through while retaining the potatoes, which rolled off the end of the elevator onto the field surface for handpicking. The complexity was in the execution. Walter's version began with the front axle and wheels from a 1936 Farmall F12 that had burned in his neighbor Ernie Folsom's barn 2 winters earlier. Ernie had sold the wreck for scrap, but had set the front axle assembly aside because the bearings were still good, and he thought something might come of it. Walter bought the axle assembly from Ernie for $3.50 in September of 1948. He welded a main frame from 2-inch square steel tube salvaged from a collapsed section of his equipment shed's east wall. The wall had failed in a January ice load, and he'd rebuilt it in March with new lumber, leaving the old steel framing stacked behind the shed. The steel tube was sound, surface rust only, no section loss. He cut and welded the frame over 4 evenings with a Lincoln arc welder his father had bought in 1939. The share was cut from a section of worn-out truck leaf spring, 3 8-inch spring steel, 14 inches wide at the cutting edge and tapering back to the frame mounting. Spring steel held an edge better than mild steel and was available in quantity from the truck spring it had been. He ground the cutting edge on the bench grinder, angling it to 25 degrees, the same geometry he'd measured on his uncle's commercial digger when he'd borrowed it the previous fall, and spent an hour looking at it more carefully than most people looked at borrowed equipment. He'd measured it because he was planning for a day when he might need the information. That day had arrived. The elevator, the moving belt that separated soil from tubers, was the part that had cost him the most thinking. The commercial units used a continuous chain of steel rods, each rod crimped into the chain links, running over sprockets at each end. Manufacturing that chain required equipment Walter didn't have. He used fence wire instead. Number 9 galvanized fence wire, the standard fencing wire in Aroostook County, sold by the roll at the farm supply in Caribou. He cut 47 lengths of wire, each 20 inches long, and bent a return hook at each end. He cut 2 lengths of roller chain, salvaged from the drive chain of the burned Farmall's power takeoff, and threaded the fence wire lengths through every second link, spacing them at 2.5 inches on center. The assembly formed a moving mat of parallel wires across the chain, flexible enough to run over the sprockets, spaced tightly enough to retain small potatoes, but openly enough to let soil fall through. The wire cost £210 for the roll. He used half the roll. Total materials: $350 for the Farmall axle, $105 for fence wire, $480 in new hardware, bolts, bearings, the drive sprockets from a farm supply catalog in Holton, and $8.65 in steel rod and angle iron from a Presque Isle salvage yard. $18.00. He finished it on the last day of September 1948. He painted it red with a half can of barn paint from the shelf above the workbench. Not because it needed painting, because it was going into the field the following morning, and he thought it should look like it meant business. Ray Kimball came by that evening and stood looking at it. He said what he said about the man who'd never seen a digger before. Walter said he'd seen one. Ray asked if it would work. Walter said he intended to find out. Ray drove home. He came back the following morning when he heard Walter's tractor start and watched from the fence line as Walter made the first pass down the potato row. The share went under the row. The soil lifted onto the wire mat. The mat moved. The soil fell through. The potatoes rolled off the end and lay in a windrow on the surface. He made the full 400-foot pass. He turned at the headland and came back down the adjacent row. Ray was still at the fence when Walter shut off the tractor at the row end. Ray asked how many potatoes the digger was leaving in the ground. Walter said he didn't know yet. He'd walk the row and see. He walked 200 feet of dug row and counted buried potatoes by reaching into the disturbed soil at intervals. He found 11 tubers left in 200 feet. He estimated his row spacing and tuber count per acre and worked out a rough loss rate: under 2%. The commercial digger he'd borrowed from his uncle had run about the same. He told Ray the number. Ray said that was better than he'd expected. He drove home without saying anything further. He came back in the afternoon with his own potato hook and spent 4 hours picking behind Walter's digger, which was the arrangement in Aroostook County. The owner's family and neighbors picked behind the digger for a share of the crop or a day's pay in kind. He didn't mention the fence line conversation again. The 1948 harvest ran 9 days. 40 acres of Aroostook County potatoes, Green Mountain variety, averaging 280 barrels per acre on the south fields. The digger ran without stopping for a mechanical failure across the full 9 days. The fence wire elevator wore on the chain links where the wire hooks engaged. He could see the wear developing by day 4, but it wore evenly and held without breaking. On day 9, he pulled the elevator assembly and measured the hook engagement wear with a micrometer. 0.018 inches of material loss at the contact point across 9 full days of operation. He calculated the remaining material at the contact point: 0.094 inches. He calculated how many additional 9-day harvests the hooks could sustain before the engagement failed. Approximately 5 harvests, possibly 6. He made a note in the farm tablet. The potatoes sold at $1.45 per barrel that fall, the price good because the summer weather had been favorable across the Northeast and the crop had come in dry and firm. Walter netted $3,980 from the 40-acre crop after seed, fertilizer, picking labor, and hauling costs. The digger had cost $18. He put the digger in the shed and oiled the chain and wire assembly before he stored it. The following summer, he made one modification. The fence wire hooks were wearing faster than he'd projected. The 1948 calculation had assumed uniform engagement, but the chain ran slightly faster on the left side due to a small difference in the left and right drive sprocket diameters. By spring of 1949, he could see the wear was uneven. He swapped the drive sprockets, left to right, right to left, which reversed the wear pattern and allowed the lightly worn side to carry more of the load, going forward. He measured the hook engagement at 10-day intervals through the 1949 harvest and confirmed the wear rate had equalized. He made a note. He also cut to 12 replacement wire lengths and pre-bent the hooks, storing them in a coffee can wired to the digger's main frame. If a hook failed in the field during harvest, replacement took 4 minutes. The 1949 harvest, 9 days, 40 acres, no mechanical failures. The 1950 harvest, 10 days. He'd expanded to 47 acres that spring, the north corner field that had been oats now converted to potatoes. 8 days of running, 2 days of rain delay, no mechanical failures. He replaced the full wire mat at the start of the 1951 season. New fence wire, new hooks, 1 roll, same 2,000 to 10,000. He put the worn mat in the coffee can with the spare hooks. He never threw away a worn part if he could learn something from it. His son Gerald, 14 years old in 1951, started working the harvest that year alongside Walter. He asked his father in the 3rd season why the digger's elevator was made from fence wire instead of the chain and rod setup on the commercial machines. Walter said the chain and rod setup required factory equipment to make. He said fence wire he had, and number 9, galvanized wire, in 2.5-inch spacing, did the same thing as the rod and chain setup for the separation function. He said the rod and chain was better in that the rods were thicker and didn't wear at the hooks. He said the fence wire was better in that when a wire broke, you replaced 1 wire in 4 minutes instead of sending the whole elevator assembly to a shop. Gerald said that seemed like good thinking. Walter said it seemed like not having 340. Gerald said he supposed that was right. The implement dealer in Presque Isle, a man named Clifton Howe who had sold farm equipment in Aroostook County since 1931, stopped by the farm in October of 1953. He was calling on farmers in the area about the new HP Hood line of potato equipment for the 1954 season. He saw the digger in the field from the road and pulled in. He looked at the digger for a while without saying anything. He asked who had built it. Walter said he had. Howe asked how many acres it had run. Walter said he'd run 40 to 50 acres a year for 6 seasons, roughly 260 acres at that point. Howe asked about mechanical failures. Walter said he'd had 2 wire hooks fail in the field, 4 minutes each to replace. He'd had a drive sprocket bearing fail in 1952, which he'd replaced in 2 hours with a bearing from the spare parts drawer. He'd had no frame failures, no share failures, no failures in any welded joint. Howe looked at the elevator assembly. He looked at the wire hooks engaged in the roller chain links. He looked at the share geometry. He said the share angle looked right. Walter said he'd measured his uncle's digger when he borrowed it in 1947. Howe said that was a sensible thing to do. He drove to the next farm on his call list. He didn't write any orders for new diggers in that neighborhood that fall. The county agricultural extension agent in Aroostook County filed his annual report with the University of Maine's Agricultural Extension Service in Orono in the fall of 1955. The report covered crop yields, equipment trends, and labor conditions in Maine's potato country. In the equipment section, the agent, a man named Philip Oakes, included a paragraph about the spec digger. He'd seen it in operation in September and had asked Walter for the materials list and cost. The paragraph ran 180 words. It described the construction method, the materials, the 18 total cost, and the 7-year operating history to that point. It noted the loss rate of under 2% and the absence of major mechanical failures. It noted that the design was a practical response to the limited capital available to smaller operators in Aroostook County during the immediate post-war period, and that its continued successful operation over 7 years suggested the design principles were sound. Walter read the paragraph in February of 1956 when Oakes brought him a copy. He said Oakes had described it accurately. He said he would have written it differently. Oakes asked how he would have written it. Walter said he would have left out the part about limited capital. He said the digger wasn't built because he was short of money, though he was. It was built because a $340 machine and an $18 machine that did the same work were not the same decision, even if he'd had the $340. Oakes said that was a fair distinction. He said he'd file the clarification in his notes. Walter Speck ran the homemade digger through the 1963 season. 16 years. He kept the acre totals in the farm tablet the way he kept everything else. 1 line per season, acres dug, days of operation, notable events. The 1963 entry was the last. 58 acres, 11 days, replaced 3 wire hooks. Total across 16 seasons, 47 to 58 acres per year depending on the rotation, averaged across the full run. 904 acres of Aroostook County potatoes. He sold the farm to Gerald in the fall of 1963. He was 56 years old. His back had been telling him things for 3 years that the farm work was making worse. Gerald had been managing the operation since 1958 in most practical respects. Gerald bought a commercial single-row elevator digger from Clifton Howe's dealership in Presque Isle in 1964. New model, $420. He told his father about the purchase over supper. Walter asked how the elevator was constructed. Gerald said rod and chain, same as the commercial units had always been. Walter said that was a good design if you had the shop to make it. Gerald said he supposed Howe's factory had the shop. Walter said he supposed so. The homemade digger went to the back of the equipment shed. Gerald moved it once in 1971 when he reorganized the shed to fit a new equipment line. He put it against the east wall. The red barn paint had weathered to a dull rust orange over the years. The share was still sharp. Walter had ground it every spring before the season, the way he ground every cutting edge he owned. The fence wire elevator still ran on the roller chain. The coffee can of spare hooks was still wired to the main frame. Gerald's son farms the same 80 acres today. The digger is still against the east wall of the shed. 904 acres of Aroostook County potatoes. $18. It looked like something a man would build if he'd never seen a potato digger before. It worked like something a man would build if he'd spent his whole life understanding exactly what a potato digger needed to do.